Thank you very much, Ed. It's always interesting to hear the perspectives of a fellow solar warrior from Sunrun. So I'll just reiterate what you guys see on the screen. Please feel free to pose any questions to Ed. I'll get to as many as I can. All the directions there should be on the screen. Great. So as we wait for questions to come in, I've got a couple of my own. The first one will be, given Sunrun's considerable presence here across the state, and kudos to you and your team for being number one, what do you think, from your own experience, are some of the main takeaways in what we have been doing out here in our isolated island chain? What takeaways, what things can folks in the solar business or policymakers, utilities, what can they learn from what we have been doing out here in our little state?
What people in the mainland can learn, or what? I'm just want to make sure I understand the question.
Yeah, what if anything have we been doing differently here, or cutting edge, or sometimes I refer to it as bleeding edge, that can be takeaways for folks on the mainland who are doing the same thing?
So I think that's a great question, and Hawaii has been a fantastic supporter of renewable energy and has done a lot of things right, and it leads the industry. So there are quite a few topics for discussion there. And I think that the first one, which I kind of touched upon earlier, was, for kind of as long a period of time as possible, having stability in the regulatory framework is enormously helpful. I think, one of the things that is wonderful about the renewable energy industry is people have so much passion for it, and they're kind of always trying to make it better in various different ways, and that's admirable and wonderful. But at the same time, there's a little bit of tension because consistency and simplicity have their own value. People understand them and can transact on it, and so it just lowers overall risks and costs for everybody. So the fact that Hawaii had such a simple, standard approach towards setting its customer rate structures for so long, I think was enormously helpful and is something I think that could be a model for the rest of the country. For instance, we've seen places like, so California rolled out over the last several years time of use rates, which I do think is good policy. We do support it. We think it will drive battery adoption. There are enormous reasons and wonderful reasons to do time of use rates. But when those rates were originally rolled out and just, again, made more complex, deployments fell for years. Solar companies had to spend tens of millions of dollars getting through the confusion. People didn't understand what was going to happen. Expectations were not set correctly. Why did the guy who installed yesterday get a better deal than I did? It gets very confusing and expensive. So stability, once you have something that's working, I think is critically important. And then the other thing I think that is happening now, which is fantastic, is the receptiveness by the utility and by the regulators here for grid services, and to figure out, okay, now that we are seeing battery deployments across the state, I mentioned it was 100% of our installations, but it's 70% of all current building permits for solar, in the island have batteries. How can we take these thoroughbreds and actually use them to the benefit of everybody? And I know that there's a lot of discussions ongoing there, where I think Hawaii is going to come out the other side a leader as well, that I think, are important and encouraging.
Great, thank you. This is a great question here, one I've been pondering myself for quite a while, for at least since the devastation in Puerto Rico. What can we learn? What can Hawaii learn from Puerto Rico? What's happened there prior to the hurricane, afterwards, and so forth in terms of rebuilding? How can we take the tragedies and the tremendous cost, loss of life, economic damage, and so forth, disruption? What can we learn from that here in Hawaii?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think that Puerto Rico and California are canaries in the coal mine for what extreme weather can do. Puerto Rico, is effectively moving to break its grid up into a couple handfuls of microgrids, or at least be in a position where they can do that, so that a single weather event that impacts one area of the island doesn't cascade and take down the power grid for the whole island. And it's tricky because of all of the areas that they've identified for these potential sort of microgrids, or really more like macrogrids that are larger than microgrid you would traditionally think of. is that there's not any location to site traditional generation in a lot of these areas. And so you just need an enormous amount of distributed generation and storage to make it all work. And I think they're moving that direction. But really, trusting the fact that the models that tell you what a 1 in 100 chance of a windstorm is, those models may not be correct anymore. And thinking ahead to is our grid strong enough to support to respond to these sorts of events, and if not, what can we do to mitigate the pain and suffering and economic loss, at least, that will result from having a grid that is not energized. You saw tremendous just emigration out of Puerto Rico to the continental United States, because with months and months without electricity, it's just difficult to earn a living and support your family and have a good quality of life. So getting ahead and I think figuring out what the solutions are to those challenges, before you get hit over the head by an awful event, rather than after, I think is the key lesson. And we're happy to do the little bit that we can to help in Puerto Rico, and I know there are a lot of other companies as well. And my hope is that Puerto Rico will come through with a shining example of what the future can be. But I mean, there are real challenges there for sure now.
One of the things I've been doing over the years, Ed, along with my staff, is tracking photovoltaic system permit data across the state of Hawaii, just to kind of get a real-time look at what the industry is doing. From 2012 to 2015, there were between 16,000 to 21,000 photovoltaic system permits issued across the 4 counties of Hawaii. Last year, in 2017, we were around 5,000, which obviously is a lot smaller than 16 to 21,000. First few months of this year, the data are showing that we're down 20-some-odd% compared to the first couple, 3 months of last year. So my question to you is kind of how alarmed are you with those kind of trends, and do you see the possibility, the realistic possibility of what the questioner asks is a second solar wave, or a new solar wave that's going to not just stabilize what we've seen over the past couple of years or so, but that we'll see an increase in adoption, which is, of course, what pretty much all energy stakeholders want to see?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, and I think storage is going to be the linchpin. Obviously, Hawaii hit these levels of penetration where the determination was made that a exporting net metered system was undesirable, and that decision was made years before storage was ready for prime time. And even today, it's not really. I mean, the electric vehicle, the demand for storage in electric vehicles is driving lithium-ion cells, kind of on the escape velocity curve to be low cost. But we, as a distributed energy industry, have to drive the whole rest of that ecosystem, the productizing of those cells into affordable storage, the power electronics that manage and dispatch the battery, the productization of it to make it install cheaply. It's not atypical right now that a lithium-ion cell that might end up for use in a residential system is less than $200 a kW, but the fully burdened installation cost, when you include the power electronics, the installation, the permitting, the whole thing might be $1,000 a kW. And that's really just because the industry is subscale. There is one manufacturer of a good inverter, 1 or 2 manufacturers of good batteries. The SKUs aren't there yet. So what we need are policies that allow the distributed energy ecosystem to drive storage and power electronics on the same cost curve that we got PV on, right? And then once we get there, I think you'll definitely see a second wave. But we are kind of in that chasm right now in Hawaii, where you need all of this new technology, and it's very expensive still, and the customer value proposition for doing it is muted, and so we need to develop that scale as an industry to get those costs down. But I think that's inevitable, and I think when you do that, we'll see another wave.
We've had a residential federal tax credit since 2005, if I'm not mistaken. Here in this state, we've had a renewable energy tax credit in some form or fashion for more than 40 years. So clearly, these have been incentives, right? So my next question is, to what extent does solar power, in this case, both solar thermal and electric, to what extent does solar power still need supportive policies and direct incentives, whether through tax credits, rebates? In other words, the money's coming from somewhere, right? From a general pot of money, the general fund, from the Treasury. To what extent do you think our industry still needs significant or greater than significant support to do what needs to be done?
I mean, I come back to the fact that, we have a global emergency, right? And, we have a decade to do an enormous amount of work. And, it's funny, the solar industry, solar panels are 99% less costly than they were, when I was born. Literally, 99% less costly. And I think as an industry, we can be so relieved to say, oh my God, those costs have come down so much, it looks so great. But we're not where we need to be in order to solve the problems that we face on the timeline that we need to solve them. And so yes, I do think there needs to be more support. But I think it is a false a proposition to think that that money doesn't end up having to get spent anyway. I was thinking about this, flying here from Oahu on Monday, it's an 88-mile flight where apparently you taxi 5 of the 88 miles, out to, it was like runway 8 right or something, and I was just looking at that runway. It's 12,000 feet long, 200 feet wide, on this enormous artificial landmass effectively in the Pacific Ocean. And the cost just to put the seawall on that thing.
And one of the reasons for that particular runway was an emergency landing site for the space shuttle, just FYI.
So yeah. I'm sure that's a good reason, but I'm just thinking, if you think about the cost, I'm not saying you shouldn't have the runway. I'm just saying that the cost that runway will need a giant seawall, right? To make it safe from water rising, and that's like just one runway at one airport in one island in one country. The cost that we face, the $70 billion that PG&E alone might have to spend to harden its electric, it's going to cost an enormous amount of money, and the faster we get going spending it, on the preventative measure rather than the reactive measures, I think the happier we'll all be.
No, that's a great answer. I appreciate that. Thank you. This may be the last question, depending on how long you want to answer it. And it's a really juicy one. We could go on for hours here at 9 and not run out of juicy questions. So I apologize to everyone who won't have their question posed. So you have the leaders of Hawaii utilities here, HECO, HELCO, MECO, KIUC, and Kauai, sitting in this room here, this august crowd, along with public utility commissioners from this state and from other states as well. What would you like to say to them directly?
Yeah. Well, I've had a chance to meet with some of them personally over the last couple days, which has been wonderful. And as I said, I think that the key thing, which I think everyone is working on, which we're excited on, is just figuring out how we harness these batteries to deliver value to everybody, and to do it, kind of as quickly and simply as we can, and in an environment where we can describe it, simply and easily to customers. Because I think that, that's going to be the key. Hawaii's renewable energy has been led by individuals and businesses. I think it can continue to be. And I know there are real challenges that Hawaii is facing first because of its penetration, but I think we can solve those with storage. And the more we can unlock those different things that storage can do, that also helps us solve this issue that storage is still really expensive. And I think that's going to be the key to accelerating growth here over the coming years, and we're excited to and privileged to be able to partner with people in trying to find those solutions.
Great. We have less than 1 minute left, so I will ask one more question here. Given the high cost of residential storage so far, what is the opportunity for grid-scale, quote, community battery, community storage in Hawaii? Has Sunrun been looking at battery storage at a more macro level than just behind the meter?
So I think the interesting thing about behind the meter storage is you end up with a lot of value streams that make it work. The customer gets backup power, so there's resiliency value. It can eliminate congestion on a distribution line. It can do time of day shifting. And because we plugged it into a solar facility, we get a federal tax credit. So it's a very efficient use of a battery, right? And I think we've got to figure out how to maximize the use of batteries. So I think it is also the case that we need grid-level storage. And I think it makes a lot of sense to connect it to ITC-eligible equipment, because then you can take the tax credit on it and lower the costs. So there's definitely room. I think we need as much storage as we can. I think personally our focus has been on the behind the meter. I think because we do think that customers do demand and are interested and are willing to pay for the resiliency component, which is sort of community battery can't really provide unless it's really wired in as a microgrid. So I want to encourage as much battery deployment as possible, but the reason we as a business have focused on the individual is because we're trying to solve individuals' problems, and we think that the battery has more value system-wide when it's put at a load site.
That's it, folks. Time's up for the Q&A. I'm sure Ed will be hopefully available to meet with any and all comers in the lobby there. But thank you so much, Ed, for your time and for my opportunity to be able to speak to you. And we'll wrap this up and a little break. So thank you very much. Ed Fenster, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.